The car engine rumbled softly as Edward Thompson drove along the deserted road leading to the town where he grew up. Tall trees flanked the road, their shadows distorted by the faint light of distant street lamps. It had been years since he returned to Willow Creek, ever since he left to try to forget the events of his childhood. He had promised himself never to return, but with his mother's death, he couldn't avoid it anymore. Someone had to take care of the old house. The cold wind blowing through the hills seemed to carry the weight of something unresolved, something Edward tried not to think about. As he drove through the old wooden gate, which creaked under the pressure of time, a wave of memories hit him. The house was there, exactly as he remembered it. Dusty windows, peeling paint, and a sloping roof that looked like the structure could no longer bear the weight of the years. He stopped the car, and as he turned off the engine, the absolute silence enveloped him. Edward sat for a moment in the seat, his fingers still gripping the steering wheel. Why did that place still affect him so much? He didn't know, but the discomfort settled heavily in his chest. With a sigh, he got out of the car and slowly walked toward the front door, feeling the old wood creak under his feet. When he opened the door, the smell of dust and memories greeted him. The house seemed frozen in time, as if the years he had spent away had never touched the place. Yet something had changed. Something in the air felt heavier. The silence of the night was too deep. Edward stopped in the middle of the hallway, taking a deep breath. The familiar smell of dust and old wood hit him with a force he hadn't expected. The walls, once vibrant with fresh paint from his childhood, were now worn, with cracks that seemed to grow with each year of his absence. It was as if time had forgotten this place. But there was something more, something he couldn't quite define. He ran his fingers along the wooden banister of the stairs, feeling the roughness beneath his skin. Every step creaked under his weight as he slowly ascended, as if the house was protesting against his presence. There was an aura of abandonment that permeated everything around him, and he couldn't shake the chill that ran down his spine. It was his mother's house, the place where he had grown up, but now it felt different. Upstairs, Edward paused in front of the door to his old room. The doorknob was cold to the touch, and he hesitated for a moment before turning it. The door opened with a prolonged creak, revealing the interior of the room, untouched since the last time he had been there. The single bed was exactly as he remembered, covered with the same patchwork quilt. The air was still heavy, as if the memories of that place had solidified with time. The silence inside the house was profound, almost suffocating, but something began to disturb that quiet. On the first night he spent there, Edward awoke abruptly, not knowing what had roused him. The clock by the bed read 3:27 a.m. The darkness around him seemed denser, and for a moment he remained still, trying to calm himself. Then he heard it, a faint sound at first, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the house. It was steady, rhythmic, like a distant whisper or the soft rustling of dry leaves. He tried to ignore it, thinking it might be the wind or the natural creaks of an old house. But the sound persisted, almost like a call, an invitation to investigate. Edward stumbled in the dark, the sound growing louder and more chaotic with every step he took. He rushed from one room to another, his eyes trying to adjust to the dimness. Every time he got closer, it would disappear, only to reappear somewhere else, like a cruel game. By the time he reached the living room, the sound became clearer, more distinct. It was a mix of muffled voices and laughter, as if many people were gathered, but there was no one there. He stopped in the middle of the room, his heart racing, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There was nothing but dusty furniture and emptiness. The sound, however, continued to fill the space. He tried to pinpoint the origin, but it was impossible. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased. Edward stood in the quiet, wondering if he had truly heard anything at all. The silence that followed was heavier than before, and he felt the unsettling sensation of being watched. The next day, Edward began exploring the house with more determination. There was something about that sound that wouldn't leave him in peace. Something was wrong, something he still couldn't understand. As he rummaged through the rooms, he came across the attic, a place he had avoided since childhood. The attic had always unnerved him, perhaps because of the way his mother kept it locked up, or perhaps because of the strange feeling that it hid something important. Gathering his courage, he pulled down the retractable stairs, which descended with a prolonged creak. He climbed the steps slowly, his heart pounding, and the dim afternoon light illuminated the dusty room. When he reached the top, the smell of mold and old wood enveloped him. Boxes and furniture covered in white sheets gave the space a ghostly appearance. A sudden gust of wind blew through the attic, slamming the door behind him. The sound that had haunted him before now returned, louder. Edward's pulse quickened. He wasn't alone up here. Then he saw it. A diary left on an old table, half covered by dust. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the yellowed pages seemed fragile to the touch. His mother's name was written on the first page, in handwriting he would recognize anywhere. He hesitated before opening it, but he knew he had to continue. As he leafed through the diary, Edward discovered his mother's words written in a tone of despair. She wrote about sleepless nights tormented by something he now recognized, the sound. She mentioned that it all began after his father's death, and that the sound seemed to be connected to him in some way. There was an underlying guilt in his mother's words, as if she had committed a terrible mistake. "I condemned him," one of the last pages said. The ink smudged as though she had cried while writing. "I found an old book that promised to keep his soul here, but I failed. I trapped him, and now he can't leave." Continuing through the pages, Edward found more details about the ritual. His mother described how she had found the book by accident. Something that wasn't meant to be found. The words were old, cryptic, but they promised something she needed to believe in. She had followed the instructions carefully, burning his belongings and reciting the incantations, believing she was preserving his presence. But instead of peace, she had trapped him in torment. "I thought it would give me more time with him," she wrote, "but I didn't know what I was doing. Now he is here, but only his pain remains." Edward closed the diary with trembling hands, his breath quickening. His mother had done something unthinkable, all out of desperation. The discovery of his mother's diary left Edward shaken. What did she mean by "he is trapped"? And why did the sound seem so intensely connected to this house? That night, after reading the final pages, Edward had trouble sleeping. His mind raced with questions, but no answer seemed clear. Around 3 in the morning, he was again woken by the same sound. This time, however, It was different. The sound was louder, more present, as if it was calling to him. Edward got up, put on his coat, and went to the living room window. That was when he saw it. In the front yard, there was a figure standing in the distance, almost blending into the shadows of the trees. The faint moonlight barely illuminated its outline, but Edward was certain the figure was staring directly at him. A chill ran down his spine. The figure did not move. It just stood there, still watching. The sound, so unbearably loud inside the house, seemed to emanate from the presence in the yard. Edward hesitated for a moment, trying to determine if what he saw was real or a product of his disturbed imagination. But the figure remained unmoving. He slowly opened the front door, feeling the cold night air fill his lungs. As soon as he stepped outside, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows. Edward looked around, confused, trying to understand what had just happened. Had he really seen something? His heart still pounded in his chest, and the cold of the night cut through his skin, but he couldn't say for sure if what he had seen was real or the product of his exhausted mind. The presence of that figure in the yard stayed with Edward. Who or what could it be? And why was it so intensely connected to the sound that had been haunting him every night? He knew the answer was inside that house, perhaps buried in the memories he had left behind. The next day, with a mixture of fear and determination, Edward returned to the attic. He knew his mother's diary had revealed part of the mystery, but there was something more he needed to discover. This time, when he climbed the stairs, he felt more prepared, but the atmosphere was just as oppressive as before. The air felt heavier, and every step echoed ominously in the dusty space. As he walked through the attic, he rummaged through the boxes and old furniture, searching for something that could make sense of what was happening. That was when he saw an old chest tucked into a dark corner, almost invisible among the shadows. The chest was locked, but the lock looked old and fragile. With effort, he forced it open and lifted the lid, hoping for answers. Inside the chest, among old clothes and items that seemed to have belonged to his father, was a small wooden box, incredibly detailed. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. As he touched it, a chill ran through his body. When he opened the box, a strange energy seemed to fill the room. The sound that had been following him flooded the attic with an almost unbearable intensity. It was as if the very air was vibrating, and Edward knew in that moment that he had released something that had been trapped there for a long time. Suddenly, he felt something at the back of his neck. Not a physical touch, but a presence that seemed to surround him. He frantically looked around, expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but there was nothing. The sound grew louder and softer, as though an invisible entity was moving closer, toying with his senses. His thoughts were in disarray. Was his mind failing him? He tried to convince himself that none of this was real, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The attic seemed alive, pulsing, breathing within. Edward descended from the attic after discovering the chest, his hands trembling as he shut the door behind him. He felt as though he had unleashed something, but he didn't know what. His heart was racing, and he knew a decision had to be made. The box, the sound, his father's spirit, it was all coming to a breaking point. He walked into the living room and stared at the old family photos still hanging on the walls. There was young Edward, smiling, his parents beside him. Back then, the house was a place of joy and safety, but that was before he chose to abandon everything. Before he ran away from his mother, from his fears, and from his own past. I could have done something, Edward muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on a photo of his father. I should have come back sooner. He ran his hands over his face, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back. All the years he stayed away, all the times he ignored his mother's calls, convincing himself it didn't matter anymore. He had failed them. Sitting down on the dusty sofa, Edward closed his eyes, his breathing heavy. It was his fault, too. Fault for not being there. Fault for running away. He knew that, in some way, if he wanted to free his father's spirit, he would have to forgive himself. He would have to accept that he couldn't change the past, but he could face what remained of it. I ran for so long, he murmured. Now it's time to face what's coming. The energy that filled the attic seemed to swallow everything around him. Edward stepped back, his senses overwhelmed by the deafening sound and the invisible presence that seemed to pulse around him. He forced himself to breathe, trying to stay calm while the world around him felt like it was spinning. The box in his hands trembled slightly, and he could feel the weight of something terrible and ancient. For a moment, he wondered if he should simply close the box and try to forget everything. But by now, he knew that the past had been waiting for him. A dark truth that his mother never had the courage to face. The diary, the figure in the yard, the sound, everything was connected. The sound became clear now, as though it had finally found a voice. Among the distorted tones, he could almost hear words, whispers of anger and sadness. It was his father. Edward no longer had any doubt. His mother had done something to trap his father in this place, to condemn him to this torturous existence. Now he had to make a decision. Why ... did you trap me? The words emerged from the air, but they sounded as clear as if someone had spoken them right beside him. Edward froze, his heart racing even faster. What he felt was not just the presence of a spirit, but the pain and agony of someone who had been betrayed. I never wanted to leave, the voice whispered, but your mother condemned me here. The weight of those words fell upon Edward like an avalanche. He closed his eyes and, with a firm voice, spoke into the emptiness. I'm sorry, ... double quotes. The words, I'm sorry, echoed through the empty attic, blending with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For Edward, the silence that followed seemed more oppressive than the sound itself. But then something began to change. His father's voice emerged one last time, softer now, almost a whisper. I forgive ... but I can't leave. What was done can't be undone. Edward felt the weight of those words, knowing that, despite everything he had done, his father's spirit would still be trapped in some way. However, there was a difference. The tone of agony and despair that once filled the air was no longer present. The forgiveness, even partial, brought a strange peace to the room. He took a deep breath, releasing the tension that had accumulated over the past few nights. He had done everything he could. Perhaps he hadn't fully broken the curse his mother had created, but he felt he had in some way given his father the chance to find some form of peace. He finally knew that by confronting his past, he had closed a cycle that had haunted him for so long. As he descended the stairs, Edward felt a lightness, he hadn't experienced in years. Walking outside, he looked back up at the attic, now silent. The sound that had once tormented him was fading away, dissolving slowly into the air, like a memory that was beginning to fade. He opened the front door and stepped outside, feeling the cold night air on his face. The night was quieter than ever, but it was no longer the oppressive silence that had once tormented him. This time it was a silence filled with relief. There was something final about the calm that surrounded him as he walked toward the car. A final doubt crept into his mind. What if his father's spirit hadn't been fully released? But he quickly dismissed the thought. He had done what he could, and now that was enough. Just as he was about to enter the car, a faint whisper floated through the air. He paused, looking around, unsure if he had imagined it. The sound was so soft, almost imperceptible, but he knew what he had heard. Edward gave one last look at the house before getting into the car, certain that, although he was leaving, he had done his best. Something from that house would stay with him forever, but now he could move on in peace.